So often, when it gets time, I think I'll stand today. When it gets to be I know there's a lever there somewhere. There it is. When it gets to be the Sunday after Christmas Eve or after Christmas, kind of a busy time for churches, and usually I'm kind of spent and just do kind of a recap of some stuff. But today, that's not where we're at. I got some stuff I want to share with you that's related to the Christmas story, and hopefully I'll be able to wake you from your slumber. And if we find out too many people were sleeping today, then we'll just rebroadcast it on another Sunday when I'm gone sometime. So anyway, that is a motivation to stay awake and with me. As we get into this thing, I'm talking about the shepherds, the wise men, and the rise of the nuns. Kind of sounds like the next Star Wars episode or something. I want to read you the passage about the shepherds first. So the context here, I haven't spoken much about the shepherds for this Christmas time. These are, pretty humble people. They're watching their flocks outside of the little hamlet of Bethlehem, which is just a handful of miles away from Jerusalem. And they experience this amazing announcement from an angel. I bring good news of great joy that will be for all people. And then he goes on and tells them, you're going to go into Bethlehem and take a corner at the oak tree and look for the manger, and there it'll be. Not quite like that. And then after he gets done saying this is going to happen, then the heavenly hosts show up. And this is like mass choir galore. And they're singing this great song. And afterwards, this is what happens after the angels go. When the angels had returned to heaven, the shepherds said to each other, let's go to Bethlehem. Let's see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. They hurried to the village and found Mary and Joseph, and there was the baby lying in the manger. After seeing him, the shepherds told everyone what had happened and what the angel had said to them about this child. All who heard the shepherd's story were astonished, but Mary kept all these things in her heart and thought about them often. The shepherds went back to their flocks, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen. It was just as the angel had told them. So just want you to notice something first of all. The shepherds got a message. They heeded the message. They went where they sensed God was nudging them to go. Nudge might be an understatement in this case. They went there, and when they were there, in that moment with the people that they were supposed to meet, they talked about their experience. And so they're there. I mean, why wouldn't you talk about it? I mean, nobody just knocks on the door and all of a sudden you're there. And so they're there with Mary and Joseph and the animals and the newborn baby and whoever might have shown up to help support and all that. And they tell them this experience. This is what God just did, and that's why we're here, and isn't it amazing? And then when they left, they kept on doing the same thing. They kept on talking about what they experienced. It says they were talking together and glorifying and praising God. I think it's one of these examples where you're not quite sure whether just talking among friends and your appreciation for God and your worship talk kicks in. It's kind of like going to the Warriors game on Christmas Day, right? We're a little nervous about how it's going to go against the Cavs. You're there with your friends. They end up handling the game pretty well, and you're outside and you're mixing it up with your friends, just talking about highlights, and yet you find yourself at the same time talking about Steph Curry and versus LeBron James and all this stuff, and you don't know where your praise of the Warriors is and where you're just being friendship talk is. You know what I mean? It's kind of a mishmash, and I think that's what we see with the shepherds. Their talk was marked and peppered with this thing that God had just done. And it was normal, and it was natural. It wasn't forced. They weren't reading something out of a script saying this is how we need to sound when we talk about God. It was just, wow, I can't believe this God did this. This is so cool, and I can't wait to tell everybody. And I think they did. I think they went and they told their shepherd friends. Okay, now let me take you to a different account of Jesus' birth. And this comes from Matthew. Matthew chapter 2. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where's the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. Actually, just to give you a little text note, King Herod was deeply disturbed, period. He was disturbed on a very big level. He was kind of known for his murderous threats and carrying them out. He was hypersensitive to threats, and so when he hears this, that's why he's deeply disturbed. He's the king. He hasn't heard about this other king that might be coming around. So he called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said. For this is what the prophet wrote. "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah. For a ruler will come from you, who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too." Now you and I know that that is not what Herod intends to do. And all the people who were there who knew of King Herod's reputation, they immediately knew. King Herod is full of it. He's trying to sucker these guys in who don't know any better, and he's gonna wipe out this little baby. After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These are gifts you give to king, from one king to another. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. So if we go to the next slide, I think we see the same model, same kind of thing happen with the Magi, the wise men. So they followed the nudge. Their nudge was a star in the east, which is really cool, by the way, because that's not a Jewish thing at all. God is speaking another language at this point to people who aren't really in the Jewish trend thing at all. This tells us that God is more interested in communicating to people than us telling God how God must communicate to people. Does that make any sense? So he chooses to use the language of the Magi to get their attention. That's the nudge. They know they need to go worship this king. So they go to Bethlehem. They get there. They share their experience both with Herod and his court, and then also, I'm sure, with Mary and Joseph and whoever's there. By the way, this trip probably took months. It wasn't just 3 guys on 3 camels. It's 3 guys on 3 camels and maybe 50 or 100 around them to protect them, to provide support for them. So when they went anywhere, everybody noticed that they were going somewhere. So they shared their experience with Mary and Joseph, and I'm sure that wasn't just cool for them, but as they're laying eyes on this child and hearing the story, I'm sure that did something for the Magi, and I'm sure it did something for all that were there. Mary and Joseph, and Jesus wouldn't have been clued in yet, but that would have been an amazing spiritual kind of moment. And then as they left, they stayed in that zone. They kept open to the nudge of God. They stayed in contact. And I think like the shepherds, they were talking about it, and the mixture of God talk and spiritual talk just kind of naturally was a part of their conversation. And because they were still tied into the zone, what God was trying to speak to them, they picked up the next nudge, which is don't go back to Herod, even though everything in them said the proper thing to do is to go back to Herod. And they went another route. I think there's some things here for us to talk about. And actually, the game changes a little bit between the shepherds and the Magi. We have more to learn from the Magi than we do the shepherds. I think the shepherds just going and talking about their experience, I think we all need to learn from that. I think this is kind of a model for us to think about what we do. Are we open to the nudge? When we do the nudge, are we open to talking about why we showed up in the first place, or why we made that call, or why we wrote that note? Just saying, hey, I just kind of thought that God nudged me on this, and so I'm calling you, not in any kind of weird churchy way, but that's just kind of what's going on. And then when we talk about it to our friends, I think that was the shepherds. Everybody they talked to is probably just like them. Other shepherds, other poor people in Bethlehem. They were uneducated people, so they talked to uneducated people in uneducated people kind of ways. They were mostly Jewish people that they talked to, I'm sure of it. And so they spoke in ways that Jewish people understood because that's the language that they had, and that's the language of the people that they were talking to. But the Magi were different. The Magi were foreigners. They weren't Jewish. They didn't look Jewish. They didn't sound Jewish. They didn't dress Jewish. They were foreigners. And when they came and had this experience, they knew they were going to take that message back. They first of all figured out, I don't know if God clued this into them at that moment, but the reason why they should not have gone back to Herod is because Herod was hostile toward this Christ child. You know, we live in a world where there are people hostile toward the Christ child. We live in a world where there are some that are so convinced that their way is so right and their way is the absolute truth that they want everybody to believe the way that they believe it, and they're willing to kill you if you don't. That's called terrorism. And it happens all over the world, and Christians were guilty of it in one chapter of our own history, which we need to be honest about it. Sometimes there are people that are like Herod, where they're hostile toward Christianity and the church because of the past of Christianity and the church. And they see Christianity as something that is encroaching on their freedoms and is bullying its way around pulpits and the political arena. And they want nothing to do with it, and they'd rather just get rid of the whole thing. There are some folks that are like that. But you know, most of the people that the Magi were going to talk to were just people who didn't really care about Israel, didn't care about Judaism. There were other thinking people like themselves who were interested in what the gods were up to. And those people are the ones I really want to talk about, because that's who we are talking to here. So I want to talk to you for a moment. Well, first I want to find out where you like to go have coffee. I need a tip. Church. Good answer, Jimbo. Very good. Of course, your wife made the coffee this morning. I saw that. So good answer on 2 accounts. Any Starbucks lovers out there? Any Pete's lovers out there? How about Pete's Coffee lovers out there? How about Napa Valley Roasting fans out there? Yep, they make great coffee. Doris, how about you? Sweetie pies. All right, very good. All right. Home? Yeah, right. You got good coffee you can brew at home. Yeah, that's right. Very good. There's a group. It's the fastest growing religious group in the United States that we need to talk about, because they're making quite a, they're not really making noise, it's their lack of noise that we need to talk about. It's going to tie into your coffee question here in a moment. This group of people are called the Nones. Not N-U-N-S, like the ladies in the habit, but nuns, N-O-N-E-S. When asked a question, and thousands and thousands and thousands of them were asked the question, what is your religious preference? They had the option to put Judaism, Islam, Christianity, maybe it even broke down to more than that, Catholicism, Protestantism, maybe it even broke down more than that, and to whatever kind of Catholic branch, or Baptist or Methodist or whatever. But an increasing number of people in the United States are checking the box, none. And that's a very new thing in our culture. 50 years ago or so, when my dad started as a pastor, actually 60 years ago now, when he was doing that, there was just kind of a cultural ethos. There were a few nuns around for sure, but for the most part, you knew what you were. You were Protestant. In fact, in the 60s and into the 70s and even into the 80s, Protestantism ruled the day. And the box that got checked the most was Protestants, which means you're not Catholic, but you're still Christian. That's shifting a little bit now. There was a cultural identity with it too. Even if you didn't really go to church that much, you knew that that's what you were supposed to say about yourself, so you did. Things have changed now. And now we have this new group that has been on the rise for decades. But in the recent years, we've seen a pretty dramatic shift. Whereas Christianity on the whole, and church on the whole, within the United States, has seen decline, 3 to 5 percentage points, kind of across the board. And it doesn't matter if you're talking Protestantism's expressions like even Southern Baptists, which are highly evangelical, or Methodist or Presbyterian or whatever, and even the Catholic Church to some degree. You're still seeing decline. At the time where you're seeing 3 to 5 points decline, the nuns are on the rise. And in the last 7 to 8 years, just that group has increased by 7%. That's a lot in terms of statistical analysis. It's a big group, and I want to talk about them, because there's the people that we need to be thinking about when we think about Christ and how to communicate good news that brings great joy to all people. Imagine that you talk to a friend about your favorite coffee place, and you are sold on that coffee place. Let's go local. So you're thinking about Napa Valley Roasting Company, and you talk about how quaint the shop is and how good the coffee is, and service with a smile, and it's Napa local and all this stuff. And you're talking and talking and talking. You're really building it up about how awesome the coffee is, the aroma that hits you in the face and all this stuff. And then finally your friend breaks in and just says, I got to tell you, man, I just don't like coffee. I just don't like coffee. So I'm really not interested in going to Napa Valley Roasting Company. If you don't like coffee, if you flat out don't like coffee, you don't care about the question of what is your favorite place to go get coffee. You don't care about Starbucks or Pete's or Sweetie Pies. And you don't care that you can make a good pot of coffee at home because you don't like coffee. Furthermore, you don't care if Starbucks or Pete's has the best customer service that has been seen in years. You don't care if they have the best music in their store that just makes you feel at home. You don't care about the decor of Starbucks at all because you don't like coffee. Now, why would you care about any Starbucks or Pete's or any other coffee place when you just don't like coffee? That's how the nuns are toward the church. They're not really hostile. It's more to them, the church is benign. It has no significance, no relevance to their life. And it doesn't matter how cool we make the place look. That stuff does matter, by the way, and I'll get to that. But it doesn't really matter if you tell them, oh man, you should see our cool fireplace thing that we just put in our lobby. It's super cool and all that. It's super warm and blah, blah, blah. And Lauren did this amazing thing with the barrel staves on their stage. And it's really cool and meaningful and theologically rich and blah, blah, blah. They just don't care. They don't care if you say, oh man, the music is just kind of authentic and real and unplugged and, you know, we like that vibe and you'd really like it. And if you make up stuff about me and say I'm decent to listen to, they don't care about that either, because to them it's just like, yeah, I don't really care about church. It doesn't mean anything to me. I mean, go. I'm happy for you. I'm not mad at you for going. But I don't want to go because I don't really care about your church. That's kind of what we're dealing with. Now, my mother and father-in-law are here visiting from Lawrence, Kansas, home of the Kansas Jayhawks. Please welcome my mother and father-in-law. Who produced for me many years ago a wonderful person who would become a wife, who is Lynn, their third daughter. So very happy about that. Usually I make lots of fun about my parents, my parent-in-laws, my in-laws, because I need to, and it's good sport. I ask you to pray for me over the next week or so while they're still with us. I ask for all kinds of grace and strength from God while they're here, and that's important. But in all honesty, while they can still hear me, I want them to know, last week I was asked after service, what's going on with Christmas and all that, and I said, Lynn's folks are coming to town. And the guy who asked me, kind of smiled and he said, so is that a good thing? And there are a whole lot of sons-in-laws that would say, well, yeah, good and bad. I got to tell you, I got wonderful in-laws. They're wonderful people. I look forward to them coming, and I'm really glad they're here. They're great people. So I've said that out loud now, and it's even on YouTube later, so you can watch that if you like, just to prove it. But one interesting little factoid about my in-laws. My mother-in-law had a bad experience on an airplane many years ago on a flight to Puerto Rico. I think I'm getting this right. And it was not a pleasant experience whatsoever. It was even a church-related trip. And somehow, God did not give them a smooth flight. From that moment forward, my mother-in-law vowed she would never get on an airplane again. And she has been a woman of her word ever since. That means that she doesn't fly. I don't know, Lee, how many times have you guys been out here now? At least 16? 18th trip. And every one of those trips has included the Amtrak train. Cruising the northern route or the southern route, and they make all kinds of friends. Well, I don't know if you call them friends, but they meet a lot of interesting people, and they have all kinds of stories to share. If you were to ask my mother-in-law, hey, tell me about what's your favorite airline? Are you a United person? You into Delta? You like Southwest? What do you think? My mother-in-law would look at you and just say, I don't care. And if you talked about the coolest airports you've been to and the airport food and which airline treats your luggage best, and what do you think, Carolyn? Carolyn's response would be, I don't know and I don't care. Furthermore, my wife, who would love to see her parents more often, just a little guilt trip here on the sly, but would love to see their parents more often on multiple occasions over our 16 years out here in California, has come up with all kinds of helpful recommendations for her mother to get over her discontent with flying, from hypnotherapy to serious drugs and alcohol, whatever it takes to get her on that plane. Even trickery, having Lee slip something into her drink just as they're on their way to the Amtrak, and they end up somehow in California 4 or 5 hours later. Crazy kind of stuff she's suggested. But you know what? She doesn't have it. Because if you don't want to fly, there is no argument in the world that's going to get you on a plane. Nothing. And that's kind of how the nuns are in the United States. They really just don't care. And they're happy for you if you found a good place and that's working for you. It's helping you in your spiritual journey, but it's not for them. And so, God bless you, but you're not going to see me there. This is the growing reality in our country. I think it's normal and natural. I think it makes total sense. In a little bit, I'm going to show you a composite picture of what this person looks like with some details according to some of the research. By the way, a lot of the research I'm giving you today and the stuff I'm giving you is from a Christian pastor of a very, very large church. It's called The Rise of the Nuns. And it has a very compelling book on what we need to be thinking about. And a lot of his research comes out of national research that's been done by Pew Research and some other groups over the years. So it's really good stuff. This thing of the rise of the nuns is very natural. You have a lot more access to information than you ever did before. We started to see this big time around the end of World War II, where the troops who'd been in the United States all the time now, they were exposed to other parts of the world, and they brought those ideas back with them, and they started to realize the world is a bigger place than just their hometown. And that started to stretch things. The 60s kind of burst things even more, and it's just been more and more information available. And now you have the whole world at your fingertips through this thing called the internet. And you use it, and you know what's happening in real time all the time. So you have more people exposed to more ideas, more beliefs, and that has risen to sort of a gray area of fuzziness on people. They're just kind of looking at things like, well, I'm just not... I just see a whole lot of ideas out there that make sense, and I'm just not quite sure that this church thing, this Christianity thing, has got it all wrapped up. I'm just not sure. So I'm a nun. One guy recounts his experience like this on the next slide. So this guy responds to his experience saying, I was raised Episcopalian, and I was very religious as a kid. Then in 8th or 9th grade, I studied astronomy, cosmology, and the origins of the universe. I remember saying to a minister, I don't get it. I read a book that said there was an explosion known as the Big Bang, but here it says God created heaven and earth and the animals in 7 days. Which is right? Unfortunately, the response I got was, nice boys don't ask that question. A light went off, and I said, the Bible doesn't make sense. Science makes much more sense to me, and I just gravitated away from religion. By the way, if you've got people who resonate with that, get them to the series I'm doing, because I love this book, and I'm going to be teaching, elements through that, and it just makes so much sense when you get the right way to approach the Bible. It comes alive, and it lets you approach it, lets you mess with it, lets you ask tough questions, and it just makes more sense. Some of you have had this experience before, by the way. Have any of you ever had this experience? Does this resonate with you? Yeah, a handful of you. I'm not surprised. Have you ever heard of the band Mumford & Sons? Any of you? They kind of brought the banjo back to the pop charts. They sang that song, I will wait for you. They're a super cool band and good music. Did you know that the lead singer from that, who's named Mumford, that's where the Mumford comes from, he's from the UK. And his parents were a ministry couple with the Vineyard Movement. In fact, they were in charge of the Vineyard Movement in the UK. What you need to know about that is that the Vineyard Movement, they are famous for a couple of things. One, they're kind of a charismatic, just a hint of Pentecostal pinched in there, which means they are very highly spiritually experiential. But the other thing that the Vineyard Movement is known for is their music. They have produced some incredible music worship that are sung still to this day all over the world. And the Vineyard Music branch still continues to produce music for churches all over the world today. I tell you that because this is not a guy who grew up in a stodgy old church that was doing things like yesteryear, and he just walked away because it was so boring. This is a guy who went to a church experience that was speaking his language all the time. Probably helped him form his musical ability. That's Mumford. And yet, when asked in an interview, are you a Christian? This is what he said on the next slide. So no, I wouldn't call myself a Christian. I think the word just conjures up all these religious images that I don't really like. I have my personal views about the person of Jesus and who he was. I've kind of separated myself from the culture of Christianity, describing a spiritual journey as a work in progress. Mumford said that he's never doubted the existence of God. That's really important. He's not an atheist, sort of agnostic, but he's never doubted the existence of God, and that his parents are not bothered about his ambivalence toward the Christian label. So this is a rock star on the global scale who's experienced this same kind of phenomenon called the nuns. When asked if he's a Christian, he can't quite say yes because of all the baggage that's attached to that word. So would you like to see a composite sketch of what a nun looks like in the United States? Let's take a look at the next slide. It's kind of hard to read, so I'm going to step over here, which is going to drive Ted a little crazy. All right. This is the portrait of a nun. This comes from this pastor of a very large church who loves the church and wants us to be effective in reaching the fastest growing religious segment within the nation. The first thing you need to know is that he's a he. More men than women check the nun box. You know why I think that is? Thanks for asking. The reason I think that's true, women are more evolved when it comes to emotions and relationships. They just are. Men kind of stink at it. Men can walk away easier than women, I think. Women, if they have relationships and are emotionally attached, I don't mean this in any negative way, so don't read that, but if they are that way toward a religious community or a body, harder to walk away from. But guys, we're simple. If it's just not working, we're going. And that's how it works. So he's a he more than the nun is a she. He thinks abortion and same-gender marriage should be legal. So if that's true of the nun, then guess how he's going to feel about religious politics in America and about how most of evangelicalism is teaching about these two social issues. He doesn't even want to waste his time with it. He's liberal or moderate. He's white. I think that is going to change over time. I think why that's significant, by the way, this is my own conjecture here, but I think the white thing matters. It's not a slight on any other race or ethnicity, but I do think in the United States there is less of a known and grasp onto Caucasian cultural identity, because I think that's just the way it is. Whereas I think in the Hispanic culture and in the African American culture, your church, your relationships, your faith, they're intertwined more deeply than they are in a Caucasian culture. And so I think this is the way it is now, but I think as you see more second and third generation, especially in the Hispanic community, come to their own and have access to the same level of information and education, I think you're going to see a lot of them join the ranks. African American community is a whole different animal, really fascinating in church world stuff. But even there, you're going to see it more and more, and I think it's tied a lot to education. This guy, the nun, is a Democrat. He's young right now. He's in his 20s and 30s. He's not necessarily an atheist. By the way, this isn't. Don't go full throttle with this. Yeah, he's young, but that doesn't mean there aren't any 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s who are young. It just says that the biggest body of them are this way. He's not necessarily an atheist like we saw with Mumford. He's not very religious, obviously. He's not necessarily hostile toward religious institutions. He just doesn't want to belong to one. And he's more likely a Westerner. This is a phenomenon that is happening for sure in the United States. It definitely happened in the United Kingdom and in France as well, but with slight variations in that. This is really important for us to get around our head. And this stuff's in my blog, by the way, which will release today, and you can watch the video, and so you can have this if you want. It used to be, when my dad started ministry, two things when they would see something like this. First thing is when my dad started ministry, it really was a field of dreams kind of experience. Denominations across the board, when they would look at planned communities, suburbs growing as World War II guys would settle down, they would literally buy land near that suburb, and they would just build the church. And people would come, because that's what you did in America. You went to church. So that really was a phenomenon. That's not a phenomenon anymore. You can build a church, but especially here on the West Coast and on the East Coast, it doesn't make any difference. Just building it means very little. Another phenomenon that you need to understand about this group, and is probably the first response to this kind of a picture, I've heard this from pastors myself as I've worked with different guys, is they'll look at this and they'll say, well, just let that 20-year-old have kids. Once he has kids in his late 20s, he's going to want his kids to have a religious education, and then he'll bring them to church, because that's the way it's always been done. We just got to wait it out, because it seems like from the beginning of time, once you reach adulthood, you're trying to figure out who you are, what you are, blah, blah, blah. And from that 18 to 30 period, you're just sort of wandering, trying to figure it all out. But once you settle down and you figure out, okay, this is really important because there's somebody else involved here, then you're going to bring them to church. The nuns aren't doing that. And we've been able to track them long enough to see that that's the trajectory. Why aren't they bringing their kids to church? Because they don't care about church. The church is benign to them. It is of no consequence and no relevance to their lives. So why would I bother my kids with church? This is the attitude of the nuns. In my dad's day and age, because there was still a strong cultural attachment to Christianity, and that was kind of who you are, what you are, if you're an American person, your first lead-off, you just assume that everybody knows the Christian story. And so Christ is the thing, if you can look at it that way, that would draw people to church. It was a compelling thing. I need to develop my relationship with God. I'm a Christian, so therefore I'm going to go to church, because that's where we learn about Christ. So Christ was the first thing that you thought about. Once they picked a church, they'd kind of feel around for community. They'd get involved with people. They'd kind of know people. And then they'd get involved in a cause if they had any time. That shifted after 2 decades or more decades than that of that mentality. The church suffered in the 1960s. The church didn't know what to do with the love revolution and the drugs and all that stuff. And with rock and roll, what is this new thing? In fact, churches who tried to implement rock and roll in the early 70s were immediately shot down by conservative pastors who said that that was the devil's music. Kind of funny now. Not so funny then. Back then, people who heard that were like, are you telling me that the beat of the drum is satanic? Is that what you're really saying? Are you kidding me? And they started to leave the church at that point. 1978, a guy who figured out that the church was not communicating in relevant ways to people who were probably looking for something better, a different expression. His name was Bill Hybels. He started the first megachurch in the United States under that terminology. And it was called a seeker-sensitive church. And what he recognized was this, that he needed to create an environment, he needed to create a church that spoke the language of the people. And that was his full-on goal. And so he left a church building, and he took a bunch of the people that were with him and on board for this vision, and he went to a movie theater. And he started holding church services in a movie theater. And he brought a band with him that played rock and roll, so the music that was all about God had the kind of feel that the culture was used to doing. He used language and examples that fit the culture. And people who didn't want anything to do with the Sleepy Dead church experience, they gravitated to this thing like, wow, this is really awesome. They wanted to be a part of that community. And once they were a part of that community, they found Christ. Once they found Christ, they were interested in the cause. What can we do together that we haven't done yet? That's all changed now. Now, at least, Lynn and I talk about this regularly. People have community outside the church. There are so many different things that kids get involved in today. You find community all kinds of different places. Church does not own community anymore. And people don't know the story of Christ. They're not really interested in that. The nun person type isn't, because it's just not what they're thinking about. And so to lead off with, well, we're about Christ, they're like, well, good for you. Terrific. Have a nice Sunday morning experience, but don't bother me. What's capturing them now, according to the research, is that they want to know that there's something out there that's doing something bigger than themselves. So causes that matter seem to be something that attracts the nun. Like, to this point, where they're not even going to bother with a community. They're not going to bother with a church if they're not doing something more than just being the church for themselves, in themselves, of themselves. Now, that's good news for Crosswalk, because we are not a church that's just about ourselves. And we got that going on in spades. I'll talk more about that later. But this is the picture, and this is the change that's happened. As this movement keeps happening, because the growth is expected to rise in this segment of our population, it's not intended. There's no evidence that this thing's going to shrink or go the other way. The author suggests that what we're going to get to is almost a medieval kind of religious experience landscape in the United States that's reflected in the next screen. So this is what we can expect more of, widespread spiritual illiteracy. So you can, especially those of you who grew up in the church like me, you can rattle off Bible stories and people are just going to look at you with a blank face. They have no idea what you're talking about. My son took a religion class this year. He grew up in the church. He knows a lot of the stories. So it was an easy class for him. But these other kids who didn't know the stories, it was murder, as they were going into the final. That's normal. People just don't know the basics of the story. My college roommate, this goes back into the 80s. He had no idea what Easter was about. And yet he claimed to be in a Christian household. No idea what Easter Sunday was about. It's just more so now. So widespread spiritual literacy, indiscriminate spiritual openness, sort of like, well, I don't know what I am, so I'm kind of open to whatever. A deep need for visual communication. This is the language of the people. If we're not doing things visually, it's why I use the screens, why we use that a lot. Attraction to spiritual experience. If we're not helping people connect with this greater other, then we're kind of missing the point. And widespread ethos of amorality. This is sort of an anything goes kind of a thing because there's no longer any measure of this is healthy and that might not be healthy. So we can expect a little bit more of that to come. So on the next screen, I give you sort of a what to do thing that I think we need to be thinking about. Today's shepherds and wise men and women, that's you and me. I think we still got to follow the nudge. I think this is really paramount, not just to reaching people, because if all we're doing is trying to reach people for the sake of reaching people, I think we've missed it. And I think they'll smell it a mile away. I think it's off point. We used to teach an evangelism class here, and it was all about how to tell your story, and the thing was so filled with agenda that we dropped it. Because it's like the only reason I was becoming friends with you is just so I could get you to say yes to Jesus someday. And that's offensive. That's not caring at all. I mean, it kind of is if you really do some theological gymnastics, but what we're looking for here is you being open to God's nudge. And here's the thing. You are in a sphere of people that matter to you. You all are. Somewhere between 8 and 15 people. You could write them down on a list. People you see regularly, the people you care the most about. All I'm asking you to do is to be open to God's nudge. Because my hunch is that God's nudge is going to be about them first. So be open. And if you're sitting there today, this afternoon, while you're watching some games or whatever, and you just feel this thing come up on your consciousness, on your radar, saying, man, I really got to give Debbie a call or Jim a call or whatever. And I haven't talked to what's-his-face for a while. First, good to get his name right. And then pick up the phone. When you get that kind of nudge and you honor that, you're kind of walking in a different zone at that point. It's like you're joining hands with God. And that's a very cool thing to be a part of. But what you don't know is why that nudge would show up in the first place. So you call Jim or Debbie or what's-his-face, and you have the conversation. And while you're having the conversation, you just say, hey man, it's so good to talk to you, and I just kind of felt this nudge to call you. Just wanted to let you know I'm thinking about you and I care about you, because you do. You care about them. That's your agenda, is you care about the person because that's what you do. And you sense this nudge. You know what I think happens when we do that? I think genuine care actually gets communicated. And I think we don't really know what all that God knows about what people are going through. Because maybe you didn't know that Jim just got really bad news, or that Debbie was just kind of down that day and just needed to know that somebody was out there. Maybe what's-his-face has been crying out to God for weeks. Can you just give me some kind of indication that you're there, that you care about me, anything at all? And then you call. You're like, hey, I was just thinking about you. That's cool stuff, man. I mean, that is cool stuff. And it happens all the time. And I want you in on the game because it's for you, but it's also for the people that you know. It's cool stuff. Couldn't you agree that's pretty cool stuff? Or you get to be a part of this game. That's pretty awesome. It's not a game. It's real life. It's real love. It's real care. And then after you have that experience, you're going to grow in that thing because you're going to see God at work. They're going to grow in that thing. Their mind's going to be open. And then I'm just encouraging to stay in the zone because there's going to be another nudge. And I think if we live in this kind of a way, I think that actually communicates great compassion and care. That it's not just about wanting to get our church bigger, because that's not the point. The point is, how can we be a people that loves Napa well and helps the people of this community experience all that life has to offer, that God has given them? That's the goal. Why do I think we've got a shot at this? One of my oldest friends lives here in the area. He's got his own wine label, and he's got his hands in a couple other businesses. Really successful guy. We went to the same church. He was baptized by my dad in the church my dad pastored. And then when my dad went into different kinds of ministry, he stayed in the church and graduated and went his way, and then we kind of round up together. Had breakfast with him a couple weeks ago. He doesn't go to church. He's interested in parts of my story. And so he's asking me different things. And he kind of caught himself in the mid-sentence. He says, I'm asking this stuff. I'm not really interested in church at all. Kind of moved away from that. But I'm really interested in what's going on with you and all that stuff because he's my friend. You know the kind of passion and tone he used when he shared this information? It wasn't hostile. It wasn't angry. It was as if he was saying, I've kind of left my VCR in the garage, and I'm not really using it anymore. That was about as passion-filled as he spoke it. Church is like a VCR. Just take it or leave it. I've just moved on to DVDs and Blu-ray and streaming. That's kind of the attitude. I understand the nuns because I kind of am one. I've shared my journey here over the years very briefly. First 4 years here were major stretchers for me, major stretchers for this church too. And I was ready to pack it in. I was ready to leave the ministry after about 4 years. I was fried. I felt like a used car salesman. I didn't like church in general. I love you people who were there back then, so don't hear that. But I was just kind of fried. I was done. And it's generally not a good thing if pastors don't like church. So I was almost done with my doctoral work, and I thought, well, if I'm going to leave, I want to know what I'm leaving. And so I went deep into the study of salvation, which is the very thing God is trying to do from Genesis through Revelation. The Jews called it the pursuit of shalom. We use the word salvation and eternal life and all these things, but what it really means is that God is trying to do this much more beautiful thing that is so much more than just about going to heaven when you die. It's all-encompassing. It breathes life into every dark place. It makes you whole, makes you a better person, really does bring peace in all sectors. That's the beauty of it, and it captivated me, and it still captivates me. But I understand the lament of the nuns because I've been there. What I'm asking you to do as a church, I'm asking you to trust my heart on this. And I'm asking you for more freedom, more openness to be able to speak plainly and clearly in language that I think makes sense, and trust my walk with God, that I'm not in some left field place, but that I'm as committed to Christ as ever. But I think there needs to be a dialogue with people who are trying to figure it out. And I think Crosswalk has something to offer this community. And it's not a competition, but I'm really confident in who Crosswalk is and who she is becoming, because we are a church that makes a difference in this community. That's one of the indicators, that we ask pastors in our region. If your church folded tomorrow, would anybody know the difference? Would they know it happened? In a lot of churches, I think they'd say, well, a few people would know. And if our church closed up, there'd be hundreds and hundreds of people who don't go to this church who would know we were not there anymore. People we help and we serve every day. Not just here locally, but 500 and more kids halfway around the world. We make a difference in the community, and we continue to look for ways to do more. These are causes that matter, and I know they matter to the people who think the church doesn't care. And so my encouragement to you is to join me in realizing that we are the new Magi, that we are the ones who have been given the charge and the challenge to be the people of God, to bring health and healing and beauty back into the world. Because we have the resource available. We have the charge from Jesus himself to go do it. And I'm asking you to go do it with me. Will you do it with me? Well, that was a resounding yes. I'll give you time. Will you do it with me? Yes. Let's do this thing. Let's pray together, and then we can be on our way. So God, the world's been changing right in front of our faces for a long time, and we're beginning to get some clarity on what it's looking like and where it's going. You haven't changed. You are as beautiful as ever. We tend to muck that up pretty well. I'm asking God that you infuse our church with new passion to proclaim very good news. that brings great joy to all people. Really great joy, and really to all people. You're about love and grace and beauty and serving and coming alongside and restoring. You're about peace. You're about love. You're about all these things that we aspire to. It's natural for us because you've created us that way. And so I pray that we'll just giddy up. And I pray that we'll get on board with you, and that we'll allow you to nudge us, and that we'll have enough faith to take you up on the nudge. And we'll just talk about the cool things you're doing in our midst, and that we'll keep being open to the nudge, because that's part of the cool factor of being in a relationship with you. So may our spiritual vitality increase. May our desire to know you more increase, because you're there with us and for us. And as we come across people who are looking and hoping for a spirituality that is deep and rooted and helps and guides and doesn't tend toward narcissism but tends toward a global worldview, may we be those people to come alongside and say, well, this is what's working for me. Why don't you come check it out? And just maybe you'll do something with that. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.